So can we begin? We are
Yes,
right at this time.
gladly.
We all are here. So I welcome all of you. I welcome Mark. I welcome Dr. Sanyal. I welcome our president, and I welcome all of you here for this very, very opportune moment of one of our webinar where Dr. Solms is going to present not only the arguments about the subjectivity which we psychoanalysts are so familiar, but the scientific argument around the dream theory. And having said that, I'll pass on to our president, Dr. Mishra, who is having to leave soon. So she would welcome you all, and then probably she'll leave. And we will continue with Dr. Sanyal's introduction, and then Mark having the speech. All right. Yeah.
Thank you, Bhakti. So on behalf of the Indian Psychoanalytical Society, I welcome Mark Solms and I welcome Nilanjana Sanyal, our chairperson today, and all of you. As we have said that these webinars are part of our centenary celebration, it's already November, and we conclude our celebration in the month of January. So we will have only 2 months more to hear the celebrities who have actually responded positively to our request to present a webinar for our society. Mark Solms is a very distinguished speaker, and we are very fortunate to have him with us today. He would be speaking about dream and neurology, and I was just talking with Mark and telling him of how grateful personally I feel to him, because the way he has restored Freud's theory of dream, it seems to me that he has done something personally very positive to me, because I'm so fond of Freud's theory of dream. And I think psychoanalysis, or all psychoanalysts do feel and do have a debt to Mark Solms for his excellent work in doing this. Mark Solms also is the founding father of neuropsychoanalysis. When he started his journal, Neuropsychoanalysis, there was a hyphen in between. But later on, the hyphen actually disappeared, making neuropsychoanalysis a new branch of discipline of psychoanalysis. So this is something very new, and he has started something which is, though only about 20-25 years old, but it is creating a kind of revolution in the history of psychoanalysis. I will not take much of your time. I was just telling Mark that I have enjoyed each one of his debates with Alan Hobson, and I also enjoyed his debates with Glass and Carmeli. I do not know whether that debate actually has ended. I think it is still going on, and I hope that Mark Solms actually today would speak about that also. I'm very unfortunate in the sense that I have to leave for another important meeting and won't be able to be present in this webinar. I simply hope that I will get the recording and will be able to hear what Mark actually has to say. With best wishes to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pushpati. And now we move on to Dr. Sanyal, and she would begin and then move on to Dr. Solms. You're muted, Nilanjana.
Is it all right? Am I audible?
Yes. Okay. Yes, yes.
Good evening, everybody, and good afternoon to Professor Solms, since he is there in Germany and it's most probably 3 p.m. At your place. Sincere greetings to all the dignitaries and participants. Hope this finds you, all of you, at your best of health and spirit. Personally, I'm most enthused and excited and feeling quite privileged to have Professor Solms grace the event of our centenary celebration with his presence, and I look forward with great interest to his presentation. The expectation is that there would be a huge amount of learning for all of us practitioners as well as academics, young and old, to take away from his lecture today. I'm specifically thankful to the president of Indian Psychoanalytical Society, Dr. Pushpa Mistro, and its secretary, Mrs. Bharti Jain, for inviting me to chair the session today. Let me take this opportunity to exercise my privilege in introducing Professor Mark Solms. He's a stalwart in our fraternity, in the fraternity of psychoanalysis and in the fraternity of neurology. He really doesn't need any formal introduction in the international platter. But maintaining the protocol of the webinar, I need to make this introduction as formally introducing him to the present participant. Professor Solms was born in 1961 and educated at Pretoria Boys School and the University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. In 1988, he immigrated to England, where he worked at University College of London in the Department of Psychology and the Royal London Hospital in the Department of Neurosurgery, while he trained at the Institute of Psychoanalysis. Post his return to South Africa in 2002, he now holds the chair of neuropsychology at the Neuroscience Institute of the University of Cape Town and Groote Schuur Hospital. He has an illustrious career. To me, he's very young, but within this time of his life, the amount of work that he has done, he would be remembered in the history of both psychoanalysis and neurology forever, forever. He's a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa and has received numerous prizes and honors, which we can't imagine also, including, but not limited to, the Sigourney Prize, the IPA's Outstanding Scientific Achievement Award, an honorary fellowship of the American College of Psychiatrists. He serves as training director of the South African Psychoanalytical Association, director of the science at the Department of American Psychoanalytic Association, and research chair of the International Psychoanalytical Association, and has published almost 350 articles, both in neuroscientific as well as psychoanalytic journals. He has also authored 8 books. His book, The Brain and the Inner World, was translated in 13 languages. His collected papers were published recently as The Feeling Brain. His latest book, The Hidden Spring, appeared this year only. He is the editor and translator of the forthcoming revised standard edition of the complete psychological works of Sigmund Freud in 24 volumes and complete neuroscientific works of Sigmund Freud in 4 volumes. Without further ado, I request Professor Solms to deliver his address and enrich us. Professor Solms, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that fulsome introduction. I am very glad to be with you. My only regret is that I'm not physically there. And one of these days, hopefully, that will be rectified. As you've heard, I'm going to be speaking to you about dream theory from the viewpoint of neuropsychoanalysis. In other words, I'm using the example of dreams to try to illustrate what neuropsychoanalysis is all about, what we are trying to add to 120 odd years of psychoanalysis. And I'm doing so partly because, as you heard in the earlier comments, there are still many people who are rather nervous or skeptical, or as I like to see it, resistant to neuropsychoanalysis. So this will give you an opportunity to see if what we're doing by trying to bring neuroscientific research methods to bear on psychoanalytic topics, to judge for yourself whether this is a good or a bad thing. So let me dive in. I'll try and share my screen. Can the host please let me share the screen? I'll need to be given co-host status to be able to do that. I don't know if the technicians are with us, if they're able to give me the facility to share my screen.
Yes, yes, Mark, you can share your screen.
Great, thank you. Okay. Oops, what happened there? Sorry.
Any problem?
No, it's me being silly. It happens.
All right, not a problem.
Okay, so
yeah.
You can see I've given my presentation the title, Why Do We Dream? Because we in psychoanalysis have a view on this question. Freud's famous theory of dreams that he published in 1900 makes the unlikely claim that dreams protect sleep. And I'd like you to remember that throughout my presentation, because that is the red thread running through what I'm going to say to you. Freud claimed that during sleep, that what he at that time called the system preconscious, this is the part of the mind that goes to sleep. The unconscious does not go to sleep. And so the preconscious, which he later called the ego, which normally inhibits the unconscious, which later became part of his id, the balance of power between these two mental agencies, the unconscious normally held in check by the preconscious, that balance of power changes during sleep. And the unconscious is relatively released from inhibition. And so repressed wishes have greater accessibility than they do during waking cognition. They then press for discharge, for motor action. And obviously, if that were to happen, we would wake up. According to Freud, that is one of the reasons why the motor system, this system here in his famous drawing from 1900, is blocked off. There is no access to motility during dreams. And for that reason, says Freud, the unconscious repressed wishes proceed in a regressive direction, backwards through the memory systems onto the perceptual system. And this is why we have an hallucinatory experience that we call the dream. The dream is, in other words, an expression of the unconscious wish released from inhibition, but rather than proceeding in the direction of motor action, it proceeds backwards to virtual action, that is to say, hallucinatory, imaginary action. And in this way, we give expression to our wishes without having to wake up to actually do so. We give them virtual expression in the virtual reality of our imaginations during dreaming. As you all know, our dreams are not direct expressions of our wishes because we are not entirely comfortable with those unconscious wishes, which is why they're repressed. And says Freud, if we were to perceive in the hallucinatory manifest dream the actual fulfillment of our wishes, that too would disturb sleep because it would cause us great anxiety and distress. For that reason, says Freud, dreams are disguised. The censorship distorts the fulfillment of the wish, and this gives rise to the manifest dream. that theory was the absolute foundation stone of psychoanalytic theory. Chapter 7 of the Interpretation of Dreams, in which Freud published the drawing that's on the screen now, became the first sketch of how the mind as a whole works. And Freud frequently repeated that dream theory was the absolute bedrock of psychoanalytic theory as a whole. You all know the method that Freud used in order to interpret the manifest dream. It's the method of free association, which enables him to see the pattern of underlying thoughts, which is the latent dream content. And it's there, says Freud, that you find the repressed wish. You infer it, you don't actually see it. Now, psychoanalysis came to dominate world psychiatry by the 1950s in America, for example, which was at that point dominating the world. American psychiatry, you could not get a tenured professorship at any decent university in America if you were not a psychoanalyst. Professors of psychiatry were all psychoanalysts. But the problem with the dream theory was vividly illustrated in a book written by none other than Karl Popper, the great philosopher of science, the book called Conjecture and Refutation, in which he laid down the basic principles of what counts as a science and unscientific theory. And unfortunately for psychoanalysis, he used this theory as an example of something that looks like science, but is not science. According to Karl Popper, a theory is only scientific if it gives rise to falsifiable predictions, whereby you can objectively test whether the theory's claims are correct or not. And Popper used this theory of Freud's as an example of a theory which may or may not be correct, but we don't count it as a scientific theory, said Popper, because it does not give rise to falsifiable predictions. And he used this argument. He said that because the Freud says that the latent dream is distorted by the censorship, and the manifest dream has to be interpreted in order to find the underlying repressed wish. He says there's no way in which you can ever have a dream which falsifies that claim, because the psychoanalyst can always say that they infer a repressed wish, that when they look at the manifest content, that the free associations is linked to it, behind that you can infer a repressed wish. And Popper said, there's no way that you can find a dream in which you do not, that by that method, that you would falsify the claim that behind the manifest dream is a repressed wish. So he said, regretfully, that this was not a scientific theory. In fact, he called it pseudoscience, which is almost a swear word. This was, of course, a great embarrassment to the scientific standing of psychoanalysis in American psychiatry, which at that time, as I said, was still very much dominating the world scene. It therefore came as a great relief to American psychiatrists when Rem sleep was discovered. So I'll just quickly illustrate how Rem sleep works. This is a thing called a polysomnograph. It's a cartoon of one. On this axis, there is time, 8 hours of time. And on this axis, there's the level of arousal of the brain as measured by EEG. What Azarinsky and Kleitman, who were the physiologists who did this work, what they predicted was that if you put an EEG onto the scalp of a sleeping person, then as they fall asleep, the level of brain arousal as measured by the EEG will decrease. You'll go from fast irregular waves down to slow rhythmical waves. And that's exactly what happens. So their prediction was confirmed. What happened after that, however, was a surprise. Within 90 minutes, the brain waves, the frequency of the brain waves increases, the amplitude decreases, and you get almost back to the level of waking arousal. And then you go back into deep slow wave sleep, and then 90 minutes later back into this paradoxical arousal of the brain, even though we're asleep. So Zarinsky and Kleitman hypothesized that this paradoxical physiological phenomenon, the arousal of the brain during sleep, might be the objective correlate of the subjective state of dreaming, because that too is a paradox. The unconscious state of sleep is punctuated at regular intervals by the conscious and indeed highly aroused, psychologically speaking, experience of dreams. So their hypothesis was that REM sleep, as it came to be known, this paradoxical arousal during sleep came to be known as REM sleep because the eyes dart about while the brain is so activated. Their hypothesis was that REM sleep is the objective correlate of the subjective state called dreaming. And they tested this hypothesis again with a falsifiable prediction. They said that they predicted that if you wake people up during REM sleep, they will report dreams. And if you wake people up during non-REM sleep, they will not report dreams. This experiment was done by somebody named William Dement, rather an unfortunate name, William Dement, but there you have it. And the prediction was confirmed. If you wake people up from REM sleep, roughly 90% of the time they report dreams. And if you wake them up from non-REM sleep, you get less than 10% of the time you get dream reports. So that's a very big difference, 90 to 10. And from that moment onwards, 1956, from that moment onwards, the claim was generally accepted that REM sleep is the physiological equivalent of the psychological state of dreaming. Why this was so important was because, as I said to you, there was an embarrassed situation in world psychiatry, namely that the dream theory, the foundation stone of psychoanalytic theory, had been described as pseudoscientific by none other than Karl Popper, because it was unfalsifiable. Using these methods, different methods, non-psychoanalytic methods, Zarinsky and Kleitman and Dement had found an objective biomarker of dreaming. Since REM sleep doesn't happen only in human beings, but in fact in all mammals, there was now the opportunity for experimental work to be done to identify where in the brain REM sleep comes from, because this will give us an objective understanding of the mechanism, the causal mechanism behind dreaming. That led to a series of studies, starting with the work of Michel Jouvet, who did some rather ghoulish experiments on cats, where he progressively sliced deeper and deeper down the brain to find at what level does REM sleep stop. Of course, at this point, we're no longer talking about dreams because cats can't speak, but the correlation between dreaming and REM sleep had been made in humans. And so Jouvet sliced down and down and down the cat brain until only when he reached the level of the pons, so right down here in the brain stem, only at that point did REM sleep stop. Jouvet made very much of the point that if you sever this at this level of the brain, if you separate the entire forebrain with its cerebral cortex from the brain stem, REM sleep persists. And Jouvet made the point that this proves that dreaming is not generated in the cortex. It is not generated in the organ of the mind. It is generated at much lower reflexive levels of the brain, in the primitive brain stem. In fact, in a structure that we share with all vertebrates. It's a very basic structure. Jouvet's student, Alan Hobson, took things a little further and identified exactly what in the pons regulates REM sleep. He found that there are a group of neurons here. This is called the mesopontan tegmentum. He showed that these cells fire rapidly as we go into REM sleep. and that other cells down here in two other structures, the name of which I won't bother you with, that these two structures, the cells start to fire much more slowly as we go into REM sleep. So these ones in the mesopontine tegmentum increase their firing rate, and these ones deeper in the pons decrease their firing rate. And Hobson made the point that therefore there's a simple switch. It's just on, off, on, off. This is how the dreaming brain works. Because as we go out of REM sleep, these ones fire at a high rate again, and these ones fire at a low rate. So he showed that this is REM on, this is REM off, this is REM on, this is REM off. And he also pointed out that this happens automatically, like clockwork, every 90 minutes. So summarizing these findings, which were published in 1975, Jouvet published his findings in 65, Hobson in 75, he showed that REM sleep, the biological correlate of dreaming, is causally generated by a very simple switch in a part of the brain that performs no mental functions. In 1977, Hobson published a further paper in the American Journal of Psychiatry, in which he argued, it was called the activation synthesis theory, in which he argued that these cells here, they activate the forebrain with a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, because these are cholinergic cells. They activate the forebrain, and the forebrain, being the organ of the mind, having all of our memory traces of visual imagery and auditory imagery and so on, being the organ of our thoughts and volitions, that these randomly activated memory traces get synthesized in the form of the dream. So that's the activation synthesis theory of dreams. Crucial to Hobson's theory was the observation that although normally when the cortex is activated, it's activated by actual events in the outside world, therefore the pattern of activity in the cortex is meaningful, it represents what is going on in the outside world. Hobson made the point that this is not the case in dreams. In dreams, the activation comes from this primitive arousal structure in the brain stem, and it is therefore random, chaotic activation of the brain, which is intrinsically meaningless. This was Hobson's point. He said, the cortex, and I'm quoting him, he said, it makes the best of a bad job. And he says, dreams are just the joining together, the synthesizing of all of these randomly activated mental images. And he said, that's why dreams are so incoherent. That is why they are so illogical, why they are so irrational, why they are so unrealistic. He said it's because it's just random activation of the cortex. He made the telling point. He said, you can, of course, after the fact, you can go look at the dream and you can find meaning in it. But he said the meaning is not intrinsically in the dream. The dream is not caused by meaning-making mechanisms. He likened it to an ink blot. An ink blot is intrinsically meaningless, but you can find meaning in it. You can project meaning into the ink blot. You can say, it makes me think of a vagina, but that doesn't mean that it is a vagina. It doesn't represent anything. It's just an ink blot. And Hobson said, that's what we psychoanalysts do with dreams. We project meaning into them after the fact. They are not inherently, intrinsically meaningful. He said, interpretation of dreams is no different than reading tea leaves. That's where things stood up until the 1980s. When I began a study in the mid-1980s, I thought, well, if the forebrain, the cortex, is synthesizing all these different images, then presumably damage to different parts of the forebrain will lead to loss of different aspects of dream imagery. So I imagined that For example, damage to the visual cortex would lead to non-visual dreams. Damage to the language cortex would lead to dreams in which we are aphasic. That damage to the motor cortex would lead to dreams in which we are hemiplegic. And perhaps the only really interesting hypothesis in my study, I thought that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain which is, as it were, the organ of executive control, the inhibitory mechanisms, similar to Freud's ego or system preconscious. This part of the brain, I predicted, plays no part in dreams because we do not have executive control over our dreams. So I predicted that damage here would have no impact on the content of dreams. Now, obviously, to do my study, I couldn't study cats or other animals. I had to study human beings who could tell me about the content of their dreams and changes in the content of their dreams. So my study took a long time to complete because I had to collect data from hundreds of patients. And I had to wait, of course, for naturally occurring lesions in sufficient numbers for me to be able to reach conclusions about what happens to the dreams of human beings with damage to different parts of the brain. I therefore only published my results in 1997. And here's a summary of what I found. I'm not going to tell you everything that I found because it'll take too much time. But the one and only prediction that I made, which was confirmed, was the one that I told you a minute ago about the prefrontal cortex, which is shown on these images in dark blue. Damage to this part of the brain, that is to say, the prefrontal cortex, has no effect on dreams. You cannot tell the difference between the dreams of patients with massive damage here and you and me. Our dreams are identical. So this confirmed that this part of the brain does not play any part in dream cognition. Everything else I found, dear colleagues, was a surprise. And I will now summarize the most important parts of it. I found that patients with damage here in the mesopontine tegmentum, in this area that generates REM sleep, although these patients lose REM sleep, just like cats and rats do when that area is damaged, the patients continued to experience dreams. This was truly an astonishing surprise because the basic rules of neurology, behavioral neurology, neuropsychology are that if you're going to claim that a particular part of the brain performs a particular mental function, then damage to that part of the brain must lead to a loss of that mental function. And what I observed in my 1997 findings was that damage to this part of the brain does lead to a loss of REM sleep, but it does not lead to a loss of dreaming, which suggests that this is not the part of the brain from where dreams are generated. What I found instead was that damage here in the parietal and occipital cortices, the back of the brain, the perceptual systems of the brain, damage there leads to a loss of dreaming. That's this part of the brain here. So patients with damage here in the perceptual systems, they lost dreaming, but REM sleep was preserved. So what that is called a double dissociation. I need to just quickly spell out what that means. Damage in the brain stem, which leads to a loss of REM sleep, does not lead to a loss of dreaming. And damage to this part of the cortex, which leads to a loss of dreaming, does not lead to a loss of REM sleep. That's what a double dissociation is. It means that dreaming and REM sleep are two separate functions. This is a basic paradigm in behavioral neurology. So that was the first really surprising discovery was that dreaming and REM sleep, although they happen at the same time, they're not the same thing. It's a basic methodological mistake, and I would like to point out that is to conflate correlation with causation. And I'd like to point out the reason that my colleagues made that mistake was because they were studying animals. the correlation was made in human beings between dreaming and REM sleep, but then they dropped the dreams and studied only the REM sleep in animals because they wanted to do objective science, and that led them to conflate correlation with causation. When I studied human beings, then the mistake was revealed that in fact REM sleep and dreaming, although they happen at the same time, are not the same thing. Now, it's not entirely surprising that damage to the perceptual systems should lead to a loss of dreams, although I will point out to you that that's what Freud's theory would have predicted, because he said dreams are the scene of action normally at the motor end of the apparatus regresses to the perceptual end, and that's where the dream occurs. So it's not entirely surprising that damage to the perceptual systems should lead to a loss of dreaming. Therefore, I want to tell you about one other very surprising finding of my study. And that's this area marked in red. Red means important. Patients with damage on both sides of the brain in this area, in the ventromedial quadrant of the frontal lobes, these patients too stopped dreaming. I want to just show you where that is. It's here, not in the cortex, but in the white matter under the cortex in this area. Now, that was a big surprise. There's absolutely no reason why damage there should be expected to lead to a loss of dreaming, but it reliably did. Here are the scans, or at least a facsimile of the scans of my patients who lost dreaming as a result of damage there. And when I looked at these scans, I was reminded of the fact that we used to, in psychiatry decades ago, we used to deliberately damage this part of the brain for the treatment of the positive symptoms of psychosis. So hallucinations and delusions were treated by severing the very area of the brain in which there were naturally occurring damage in my patients who lost the ability to dream. This operation was performed in exactly that same part of the brain to treat hallucinations and delusions. That operation was called prefrontal leucotomy. I went back to the old literature and I found two things of interest. The first was that nobody had ever reported a single case of loss of REM sleep in a human being due to damage in the mesopontine tegmentum, who also reported loss of dreams. Never had that basic rule of neuroscience been fulfilled. Nobody had ever shown, because I thought there must be something wrong with my findings. How come all my patients with damage here still dream? And then I found nobody had ever shown that damage here leads to a loss of dreaming. However, in the patients with prefrontal leucotomy, these patients regularly reported loss of dreaming. In fact, one German neurosurgeon by the name of Schindler, he observed in the 1950s that if after the operation, this operation which was performed on thousands of psychotic patients, if after the operation the patient continued to dream, this was a bad prognostic sign. And on reflecting on that observation, it occurred to me, well, that makes sense. If you can generate an hallucination and a delusion in the form of a dream, then the operation hasn't worked, because the operation is aimed at the suppression of positive psychotic symptoms. In other words, I can see why a patient, if after this operation they can still dream, why the worry is that they can still hallucinate and delude themselves. This was Schindler's reasoning as to why it was a bad prognostic sign. The patients who continued dreaming did badly. The patients in whom dreaming was lost did well within the criteria of what they were looking for, which was suppression of those symptoms. There was, interestingly, a major side effect of that operation, which is that the patients lost their spontaneous initiative and drive and motivation. But on the basis of that observation, I came up with a hypothesis as to why damage here should lead to a loss of dreaming. And that was that it's due to damage to this brain circuit, This brain circuit is the reason I focused on it is twofold. The one is, as I told you, this operation led to a loss of motivation. This is the major motivational circuit of the human brain, the mesocortical, mesolimbic dopamine system. But also because that operation, the prefrontal leucotomy, was replaced by antipsychotic drugs, which block activity in this system. So this system, as you all know, no doubt, antipsychotic drugs are dopamine blockers. And particularly they block the type of dopamine receptors that we find in this circuit. So the area where the operation was performed cut exactly this circuit, the circuit against which antipsychotic drugs act. So my hypothesis was this, rather than the pontine region here, which activates the forebrain in REM sleep, I hypothesized that this motivational circuit, this dopamine circuit, rather than this acetylcholine circuit, that this was the circuit that drives dreams. Now, remember, the value of bringing methods like this to bear on our theory is it gives rise to predictions which are testable. And so I tested several predictions arising from this hypothesis. The one I've already told you, that cutting that pathway, as occurred in the natural damage in my patients and in the prefrontal leucotomy operation, would lead to loss of dreams. But I predicted that if we give patients dopamine, the levodopa, the drug which increases activation of this system, this will lead to increased dreams. And if we give them dopamine blockers, antipsychotic drugs, this will lead to decreased dreams. And that is exactly what we found. We found that if you give patients dopamine stimulants, they have increased frequency, increased duration, increased emotional intensity, and increased bizarreness of dreams. Also, there's an increase in nightmares. So every prediction arising from the hypothesis that this system drives dreaming was confirmed. And the opposite happens when you give dopamine blockers. All of those variables are decreased. So that was consistent with my prediction. This slide shows you a study done by my colleague Alan Brown. He used a different method called positron emission tomography, where he looked into the brain of dreaming human beings to see where the activation was, what part of the brain is activated when we're dreaming. And what he found was, first of all, exactly what I found in my lesion studies, that the prefrontal cortex, which is here, the prefrontal cortex is deactivated during dreaming sleep. It doesn't play any part in dreaming sleep. But by sharp contrast, the mesocortical, mesolimbic dopamine circuitry is lit up like a Christmas tree. There you see it massively activated, that part of the brain which I hypothesized is what's driving the dream process. That is massively activated, and the prefrontal cortex is deactivated. I was asked to say a word about psychosis during my presentation. I've already linked my observations with observations on psychosurgery for psychosis and on observations of psychopharmacology for psychosis. I want to just mention that the imaging of schizophrenic patients also shows deactivation of the prefrontal cortex. So the same thing as we find in the dreaming brain, there's deactivation of the prefrontal cortex, and there's hyperactivation of the mesocortical, mesolimbic dopamine system. So basically the same shift, loss of inhibitory control and increased motivational drive, we find this dopamine driven, we find the same thing in psychotic patients. And there's one other very interesting thing that we find in psychotic states. For example, David Silberzweig imaged paranoid schizophrenics while they were having auditory hallucinations. And what he found was this thing that we also find in dreaming, that there is an activation of the perceptual systems. This is the actual hallucination, the regressive activation of the perceptual systems that gives rise to the hallucination. In dreaming, it's primarily visual, but in schizophrenic hallucinations, it's primarily auditory. But we see that same configuration. So I'll just repeat it again. Deactivation of the inhibitory controls of the prefrontal cortex, massive arousal of the dopamine motivational circuits of the subcortex, and regressive activation of the perceptual systems giving rise to the hallucinatory state. There are two other findings I want to quickly mention. They were published by colleagues of mine, not studies done by me. This one showed that these cells, they measured them with single cell electrodes, that these cells fire at their maximum rate during dreaming sleep. And the other study that I just showed you, using microdialysis, another method, showed that dopamine is released in maximal amounts at the terminus of this circuit during dreaming sleep. So lesion studies, brain imaging studies, psychopharmacological manipulations, single cell recordings, and microdialysis of the chemical, the neurotransmitter levels in the regions of interest. All of those confirm that this is the circuit that drives the dream process, not the cholinergic system from the pons. In fact, if you block acetylcholine, it has the opposite effects of what you expect. It doesn't lead to a loss of dreaming, it leads to increased dreaming. But it actually leads to hallucinations while you're awake too. So Hobson's theory was really severely tested by these findings. This picture that I've showed you already, I think perhaps many of you will have made this observation yourselves. This is pretty much how you would expect the brain to look if you were Freud. Freud's dream theory says that during sleep, the ego or the pre-conscious, the executive systems of the mind go to sleep, but the id, the arousal systems, the motivational and emotional systems do not go to sleep. They're thereby released from inhibition. And said Freud, that would wake you up. This is a massively motivated brain that you're seeing here. So on the Freudian theory, that should wake you up. And says Freud, that's why we have a regressive activation of the perceptual systems, and we have an hallucinatory action, which preserves sleep. That was Freud's theory. So I debated Alan Hobson. I was happy to be invited to an Oxford Rules debate with him in 2006, in which I presented these findings and said, it seems that Hobson owes Freud an apology. Our audience, after listening to Hobson's arguments and my arguments, I was very pleased that our audience of assembled neuroscientists voted 2-1 that the Freudian theory was scientifically viable once more. I forgot to mention earlier in my talk now that when Hobson presented his findings to the American Psychiatric Association in 1976, a vote was taken then on the basis of Hobson's activation synthesis theory. In the American Psychiatric Association, which, let us not forget, was dominated by psychoanalysts until the 70s and beyond, the vote went against Freud at a ratio of 2-1. The assembled members of the American Psychiatric Association in 1976 said that Freudian dream theory was no longer scientifically viable. Now, 30 years later, an assembly of neuroscientists at the Consciousness Conference where we had our debate voted the other way. So I was really pleased that the tide was turning, and this evidence that the dreaming brain looks pretty much like what we would have expected in light of the Freudian dream theory was confirmed. Now, it's what I've just said, I think, is very impressive. You must remember, Freud was using purely psychological methods, the free association method, and on the basis of that very rough and ready data, he inferred that behind the manifest dream is something like this: massive motivational, wishful arousal, which is what this system does. It's called the seeking system or the wanting system. It's the brain reward system. It is the main motivational, positive motivational system of the mammalian brain. Freud inferred this using psychological methods. And now with these methods, these neuroscientific methods, which we in neuropsychoanalysis are trying to add to our psychoanalytic methods to bring a different methodological perspective on these problems, reveals objectively that the latent dream that Freud inferred psychologically, the actual causal mechanism of dreaming is a massive motivational surge during sleep, which is disinhibited by the normal executive controls. I'm saying all of this because I think that we really do owe Freud an apology. Neuroscience owes Freud an apology for having dismissed his findings before the critical tests of them were possible. And remember, Popper said you have to give rise to prediction. Your theory has to give rise to predictions which are falsifiable. I'm saying in Freud's day, we didn't have methods whereby we could test those predictions, but now we do have methods. And this is why I'm saying we owe him an apology. I've already told you that this system, this brain reward system or seeking system or wanting system, performs roughly the job that Freud attributed to the libidinal drive. I'll just show you two quotations from two neuroscientists involved in this area. Panksepp is a great expert on what he calls the seeking system, this brain reward system. And he points out that stimulation along this pathway results in the most energized exploratory and search behaviors an animal is capable of exhibiting. And Dahan, the chap who did the study, this one over here with the single cell recordings, he points out that the way that these neurons fire in this circuit fire during dreaming sleep is the same as they do when the animal has intense motivational rewards. So everything points to the idea that a positive motivational reward system is driving the dream process, just as Freud inferred. Now I need to emphasize, I'm coming towards the last part of what I want to tell you. I need to emphasize that what I've described, the dreaming brain, is consistent with Freudian theory. It looks like what you would expect from Freudian theory, but I have not tested a prediction that arises from the theory where there's the possibility of falsifying it. So that's why I did the last study that I'm now going to tell you about. And in fact, this is an ongoing study. We haven't yet completed it. We've done the pilot phase of the study. I'm going to give you the pilot data. We are now here in Germany, in Berlin, in the Charité Hospital, which is one of the reasons I'm here. We are concluding the larger study that arose from the pilot data I'm now going to report to you. So here's the study. I want to just summarize what I've said to you already. I said that the fact that this brain system, this seeking or wanting or reward system, this dopamine drive system is so activated during dreaming sleep, a system which gives rise to the most energized search and exploratory behaviors that an animal is capable of exhibiting. It is truly astonishing that such motivational urge can occur while we're fast asleep. How does the animal or the human being stay asleep with such massive motivation? Coupled with the fact that it is disinhibited, the frontal cortical controls on that motivational surge that normally keep it in check are not present during dreaming sleep. So how is it that this animal or human being does not wake up? Freud's theory is they don't wake up because the arousal regressively activates the perceptual systems and generates a hallucination. So here we have the possibility of a testable prediction. my prediction is that if you have damage to these perceptual systems, which prevents you from having the hallucinatory dream. Remember, I told you that patients with damage to these systems lose the capacity to dream. And you still have intact motivational urge or motivational surge during dreaming sleep, during when we normally have dreams, then because you can't have the hallucination due to the damage to the perceptual systems, you should wake up. If dreams protect sleep, then patients with damage here who cannot generate the hallucination, but who still have the motivational surge, they should wake up. That is a falsifiable prediction. I need to make that very clear, that it can go either way. You take patients with damage here who do dream and compare them to patients with damage here who do not dream. The prediction is the ones who do not dream will have bad sleep. If they do not have bad sleep, then dreams do not protect sleep. So that's a falsifiable prediction. And so this is the study that we've done, the pilot study, which I'm now going to show you the findings of. And this is the study that the biggest study that we're now concluding here in Berlin. We took patients who had strokes in the posterior cerebral artery with damage here, who as a result of their strokes were not dreaming. And we compared them with patients who have damage also from strokes in the posterior cerebral artery, but who are still dreaming. And our prediction was that the ones who are not dreaming will have poor quality of sleep compared to the ones who are dreaming. I need to point out that that's a counterintuitive prediction. The lay person, somebody who's not au fait with Freudian theory, would say, if you can't dream, you'll sleep better because dreams disturb sleep. It's only the Freudian who says, no, dreams protect sleep. Therefore, if you can't dream, you'll have worse quality of sleep. And so that's what we are predicting. We predict that the patients who don't dream, who can't dream due to damage to the perceptual parts of their brain, they will have less total sleep time. They will spend more time during those 8 hours of the night when we're supposed to sleep. They'll spend more time awake. They'll have more awakenings, more arousals, and more micro-arousals. These are all the things that we measure in terms of quality of sleep. So now I'll quickly summarize my results for you. I showed you at the beginning of my talk a cartoon of a polysomnograph. I'll just show it to you again. Remember, the x-axis is time, 8 hours of time, and the y-axis is brain arousal, level of activity as measured by the EEG. So this is a cartoon. I'm now showing you real ones. Here's the first patient that I tested, a patient who cannot dream due to a stroke in her occipital lobes. This is 8 hours of sleep, or 8 hours. Yes, here's where we switch the lights out. Here's where we switch the lights on. That's 8 hours. And this is the level of arousal of the brain. So you see, for the first 2 hours, this patient could not fall asleep, this non-dreaming patient. And when she did fall asleep, she immediately woke up. She then finally fell asleep for the 3rd hour. Then she woke up. And from then onwards, for the rest of the night, every time she fell asleep, she woke up again. And this is really terrible sleep. And interestingly, when she goes into REM sleep, which is there, she wakes up. And here again, when she goes into REM sleep, she wakes up. So this is exactly what we predicted. They would have poor quality of sleep. This patient has sleep onset insomnia, and she has sleep maintenance insomnia. And when she goes into REM sleep, because she can't dream, she wakes up. This is the second patient that I tested in the sleep lab, a non-dreaming patient. She fell asleep relatively easily, but could not stay asleep. So again, you see this sleep maintenance insomnia and waking up from REM, waking up from REM. This is the same pattern as the previous patient, the only difference being that this patient could fall asleep, but she couldn't stay asleep. Now I'll show you the third patient. That's this one. This is the most astonishing polysomnograph I've seen in my life. This patient simply couldn't sleep. Many patients tell us, I had no sleep last night, I couldn't sleep at all. But if you put them in a sleep laboratory, you find they have a hell of a lot more sleep than they think they have. This patient really did not sleep. For 4 hours, the patient didn't fall asleep. 4 hours later, fell asleep for just a few minutes and woke up again. Fell asleep for a few minutes and woke up again. Then couldn't sleep. Fell asleep for really just fragments and then awake again. You see this, it really is an astonishingly bad quality of sleep. Here's the fourth patient. Again, you see the same pattern. Looks like New York City's skyline, sleep maintenance insomnia. And this is what they're like. Patients who don't dream, they have sleep like this. I'll now show you the summary data of how they compare to stroke patients with damage in the same perceptual systems of the brain from the same arterial field, thrombotic infarctions of the posterior cerebral artery, the ones who do dream compared to the ones who don't dream. Total sleep time in minutes. Dreamers sleep for 375 minutes on average. Non-dreamers for 267 minutes. So percentage of time asleep, the dreamers spend 3/4 of their time asleep, of those 8 hours, the non-dreamers half their time asleep. It's a big difference. By the way, you might wonder why they only sleep 3/4 of the you must remember these are very ill patients. They've suffered strokes. So it's not surprising that they're not good sleepers. But look at the statistically significant difference between the dreamers and the non-dreamers in terms of the percentage of those 8 hours that they spend asleep. Now I'm going to show you a standard measure of sleep quality. It's the sleep efficiency index. Again, you see a massive, nearly 20 percentage point difference between dreamers and non-dreamers in terms of their sleep efficiency. So our prediction that the non-dreamers will have poor sleep efficiency is exactly what we find. This is called an awakening index. I must tell you what an awakening index is how many times the patient wakes up per hour of sleep. So for every hour that you sleep, how many times do you wake up? The dreamers wake up 3.5 times per hour of sleep. The non-dreamers 12.5 times per hour of sleep. This is an enormous difference. Arousals, which are brief awakenings, how we define an arousal, 1 minute awakening. The dreamers wake up 19 times, they have these brief awakenings 19 times per hour of sleep. The non-dreamers 48 times per hour of sleep. Astonishing difference. I mean, very seldom in behavioral neuroscience do you see such stark differences. This is chalk and cheese. The same applies to microarousals. Microarousals are less than 1 minute long. Physiologically, the patient is awake, but it's so brief, they don't even realize they've woken up. Again, the dreamers have 15 per hour of sleep of these microarousals. The non-dreamers 39. Again, chalk and cheese, massive difference. So, dear colleagues, that's the end of what I wanted to say to you. This is the first time that we have directly tested a prediction, a falsifiable prediction arising from the Freudian dream theory that dreams protect sleep. And we have confirmed, we have supported the theory experimentally, demonstrating that whatever else dreams do, one thing we now know is that they protect sleep. And so that's an extremely gratifying moment. I'll add to that, that this is the first time that anyone has found any biological function for dreams. It's an embarrassment to science. We spend 20 to 25% of our sleeping hours dreaming, and nobody knows why. Well, at least we found one reason why. It's because dreams protect sleep. I gave this talk to another audience recently, and in the audience was a colleague of mine with her little daughter, 5-year-old daughter. And her daughter listened to my presentation and then went home with her mother and did a little drawing before she went to bed to summarize what she had learned from my lecture. So I thought I would give you a 5-year-old level summary of everything that I've said to you. Here it is. On the 11th of June, 2020, she wrote, why do we dream? And she answered, so we can have a good night's sleep. Thank you very much. That's what I wanted to say to you. I look forward to the discussion and to any questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Solms. I'm simply overwhelmed with your presentation. What a conjugation between the neurology and the psychoanalytic explanation of dreams, especially that of Freud's theory of dream. It was indeed a most enriching session with a huge amount of learning and renewal of learning for all of us who are present here today. The difficult task, which is also the singular privilege of speaking a few words in continuation, falls on me. However, let me make an effort to do so. I would not be wrong to state that I'm still resonant to the professor's words and the complex concepts that he put into such clear and simple enunciation for all of us to appreciate. He began his commentary with the Freudian foundational principles of dreams, like conscious, unconscious, preconscious. You mentioned about unconscious and preconscious, and the quality of sleep, hours, etc., linking it to later interpretations and findings. You most lucidly elucidated the overlapping mechanisms between dreams, consciousness, emotions, and memories, the contents that come in the repressed material form that constitute ultimately the dream structure for us. Considering the difficulties of mapping brain mechanisms in relation to the function of dreaming, you highlighted various methodologies, quoting the examples of your colleagues' studies on the cat's brain. So it is just not the human brain that you are dealing with. There are colleagues of yours who are working on the animals' brains also in order to locate the exact region which is responsible for our dream formation or the dwindling of dreams. So the various methodologies that you have mentioned in your lecture, they are of high interest to all of us. Moving on to the scientific explanations and findings regarding the relations of the REM sleep state to the state of dreaming, you have pointed out that various misconceptions still abounding within the practitioners community, as well as the key experiments that contribute much to our present understanding of dream mechanism. Your analysis of the seminal works in the field of REM sleep research, its dissociation with dreaming, and other groundbreaking investigations in clinic anatomical scrutiny was most interesting. You spoke about Yuvan's study that lower parts of the brain is responsible for REM sleep, which has got its direct connection with our dreaming process. You mentioned about Hobson's work in detail, and you talked about the activation synthesis theory. You explained that theory to some extent, that primarily spoke of the function that the forebrain plays of trying to make a sensible experience during REM sleep out of the intrinsically incoherent images thrown up by the brainstem. The theory states the activation synthesis model. The activation aspect of the model argues that dreaming is activated by cholinergic mechanisms, as you have mentioned, in the pontine brain system. They posited that it is this activation which actually causes dreaming and is hence motivationally neutral. The second part, which is the synthesis aspect of the model, talks about the frantic attempts of the forebrain to piece together or synthesize the meaningless conscious representations in the form of memory images, thoughts, and feelings that are randomly stimulated from the brainstem. In this regard, I can say at least three distinctive points I could collect from your presentation. One is the lower part of the brain is responsible for REM sleep, which has its direct connections with dreaming processes. The second is damage to the perceptual system should lead to a loss of dreaming. And you have talked about your colleagues' findings also in this respect, and you have shown us the graphs, the models, how the damage is causing the depletion in the nature of sleep and hence the damage to the dream process. The third point that I could gather is the dreaming and REM sleep are two separate functions, totally separate functions. And in this context, you have mentioned about double dissociation theory. Another point that I picked up, that intrinsically the dreams are meaningless. You have mentioned that they are almost like ink blots to which we project our meanings. The dream contents are like the ink blot system to which we associate our meaning. Since the forebrain's contribution you were discussing to the process is secondary to a primary brainstem driven process, it was argued that the dreams themselves are epiphenomenal to the REM sleep. Freud had already speculated a similar sort of theory as early as 1900, when the subject of neuroscience had not existed in the present form. Freud had termed dreams as froth there. However, later research dissociated the relation between REM state and our dreams. Your exposition of the primary driving force of the dream process and the complex system of the human mental life was very comprehensively imparted to us. Some of the research on the physiological processes of the dreaming brain and the emotional brain that you have highlighted had the link between the damage in the visual area and the resultant, not only the visual area, the prefrontal cortex, and the resultant learning disabilities. If the memory or feeling activates the interest of the seeking system, which in other words are our appetitive interests or unfulfilled desires, this would be enough to begin the dream process. The dream occurs instead of a motivated action. That is, instead of doing something in the real world, we dream about it. Significantly, in our dreams, the focus of motivated cognition is dissociated from our goal-directed action systems and moves into visuospatial components of our perceptual systems. Functional imaging studies, as shown by you, showed that the anatomy involved in dreaming is very close to that of the psychotic system of mental processes. You showed us the brain structures of schizophrenic patients, psychosis with one substantial difference, but the substantial difference located was in schizophrenia, most probably, it was, this is my hunch, the audio verbal component is more important than the perceptual system, which is activated in visuospatial form with so-called normal individuals. Another important finding that you shared is related to the difference in the directional flow of information during dreaming as contrasted to the visual regions in the brain connected to the physiological systems and functions in dreaming. The hierarchy of the primary, middle, and highest zones seems to be reversed, and damage to the primary visual cortex or prefrontal cortex has surprisingly no effect on dreaming at all. The neurobiology of dreams was splendidly elaborated in your lecture. We are very, very thankful to you, sir, there. One thing that clearly came out in your deliberation is the need of interdisciplinary research collaborations to establish untested hypotheses. You have mentioned a number of hypotheses that needs to be tested in order to be confirmed about our findings. Your eloquently spoken modern neuroscience and its advancement of understanding the the biological basis of dreams, which in turn has helped our understanding of certain core processes of psychosis because of its established correlation to the process of dreaming. In the later part, you mentioned about this. This overall is a very, very significant confirmation of Freud's hunch that understanding dreams may provide us with a key to understand the mental illness in general. That is how I hear you, sir. And again, I feel privileged and enraged. Thanks again, Professor. I look forward to read your proximate works with immense interest, and then I can vouch for my colleagues also, who would also like to do the same as well. Let me ask my colleagues and friends to take over from here. But before giving the opportunity for others to talk about certain questions that they have in their mind, I have a question to you, Professor. As because you said that the repressed contents in the preconscious censoring process, they have this less inhibition process that allows the material to come to the area of preconscious, we develop our dreams. In case of clients who are extraordinarily stressed in life, stressed because of life conditions, or maybe stressed because of a physiological disease within them, sometimes we find that they have very common experiences of dreams, but they very commonly report anxiety dreams. Can you explain this process a bit?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your splendid summary of and highlighting of the main points of what I tried to get across. I appreciate your generous comments very much. Your question concerning patients who are in distressed frames of mind for whatever reason, why they have increased dreams and in particular increased anxiety dreams, I can link that to the issue of why does dreaming and REM sleep correlate? Because I think that's one of the other big questions that arises out of the astonishing mistake that we made to think that they're one and the same thing. So what we find is that there are three periods during the night when we have the most dreams. One of them is during REM sleep. The other one is immediately after falling asleep. We call them sleep onset dreams. As you're descending into sleep, so 50% of awakenings then produce dream reports. And the third one is that as your brain is cranking up in the morning, it's called the late morning effect. There's increasing cortisol levels, and this is your sympathetic nervous system getting ready for the challenges of the day. So during non-REM sleep, at that stage of sleep, the late morning, we also have many more dreams. In fact, we have dreams which are entirely indistinguishable from REM dreams. So the common denominator between those three things, sleep onset, REM sleep, and the rising morning phase, is arousal. In all of them, there's arousal. There are different forms of arousal. The brain is relatively aroused when you're first falling asleep. It's aroused by REM sleep, and it's aroused by cortisol as you head toward waking in the morning. So anything which increases brain arousal is disturbing sleep. Anything that disturbs sleep is going to provoke dreams if dreams have a sleep protective function. And so the kinds of things you're talking about, stressful states of mind and body, they lead to increased dreams. In fact, fevers and infections, it's well known, and seizure disorders, seizures very frequently occur during sleep. All of these correlate with increased dreams and increased anxiety dreams and nightmares. Anxiety dreams are extremely common in seizure disorders, in febrile disorders, in toxic and metabolic and infectious conditions altogether. And the common denominator across all of them is there's more arousal There's more sleep disturbance and therefore more dreams. If you, I told you that if you give levodopa, which is the dopamine agonist, if you give this to normal subjects, which we studied, they have not only more dreams, longer dreams, more frequent dreams, more emotionally intense dreams, more bizarre dreams, but also more nightmares. And you must remember Freud's theory about nightmares, which I think is consistent with these observations that I've just summarized for you, including the seizure disorders, is that they are failed dreams. In other words, they are failed attempts to protect sleep. If the arousal, be it emotional or physiological, if the arousal is too intense, the dream fails, and then you wake up. And so that's how we understand the fact that you give too much dopamine or you have a seizure during sleep, the dream cannot contain the process, the anxiety state, therefore supervenes and the patient wakes up. So it is, I think the evidence is very consistent with Freud's old idea that basically nightmares are failed dreams. They're failed attempts to protect sleep through wish fulfillment. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Professor.
I see that there are comments in the chat line here.
Yes.
Must I address those starting at the top, or how do we do it?
Sure. So, Mark, you can start answering or addressing the questions in the chat. In the meanwhile, if somebody wants to ask something, we will take that as well.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So would you start with the questions there, or would I just type in my question or just speak it out?
No,
Yeah, you can speak it out, Bulbuldi, and we can take that, and then we can take the other questions.
So my question is, like in dreams, the prefrontal cortex is deactivated, right? So my question is about the censorship function of the dream. So would you say that the censorship function doesn't happen during the dream, but you talked about the ink blots and that we project that the censorship is actually happening in the waking hours? Or how do we explain the censorship function of the dream? Yes. Yeah.
Well, first of all, although this is not addressing your question, I just want to say for clarity's sake, that the ink blot statement is not mine. The ink blot statement is Hobson's. I don't agree with him. I think that the fact that dreams are driven by the dopamine motivational systems of the brain means they are intrinsically motivated, meaningful emotional states. I don't believe that the meaning is added on afterwards. Of course, it is in part. We all know about secondary revision and all of that. But the findings I've reported to you, I think, they contradict the idea that dreams are inherently meaningless. And there's a lot else that I could say about that, but what you're asking is a more specific question. And my answer to it is, it's interesting, because Freud first introduced the idea of the censorship in his dream book. I think many people get the impression that there's this thing that occurs during dreams called censorship, which is not there during waking life. And nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the censorship is much more active during waking life than it is during dreams. When Freud says the ego goes to sleep, or the pre-conscious system is decaffected during sleep, what he means is that the inhibitory censoring agency of the mind is degraded during sleep. But it doesn't go to sleep entirely. In other words, there's not no ego function and no secondary process. Any parent knows when they have a young baby in the house that you can keep an ear out while you're sleeping. You know, it's not as if you're not in a coma. You know, you just have a massively reduced level of a pre-conscious or secondary process or reality principle type of function. So,
Mark, we understand how Freud sees censorship in dreams. But my question is about, from your studies and findings of how the brain functions during sleep.
Yes.
How can we censorship?
I link that observation of Freud's with our observations on how the brain functions during dreaming sleep. The prefrontal cortex is massively deactivated during dreaming sleep. That is the anatomical equivalent. I'm putting it in simple terms. Obviously, you know, in such a brief conversation as we're able to have, I can't go into all of the details of how we understand secondary process functioning, preconscious functioning, executive control, and so on. But in broad headline terms, the prefrontal cortex is what performs those inhibitory functions. And so the prefrontal cortex is degraded in terms of its activation during dreaming sleep, which means that those inhibitory functions are degraded, but they're not completely absent. And this is why the censorship is that we see in dreams is an extremely crude form of censorship compared to the censorship that we have functioning during our waking life. This is why it's much easier to see the hidden motivations in dreams than it is to see the hidden motivations in waking cognition. I hope I've made that clear.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Anybody else? All right, then maybe we can go to one of the questions in the chat. I will just read it out. Is there a significant difference in the content and or nature of dream in patients with damage or lesion in left side versus right side of their VMPFC?
So first of all, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, is that what you mean? So in order to have loss of dreams.
Yes. I meant ventromedial prefrontal cortex.
Yes. So in order to have, first of all, to have loss of dreams, the damage is in the white matter in the ventromedial quadrant. It's not in the cortex. It's in the white matter, the dopamine, the medial forebrain bundle that projects to frontal cortex. And the damage has to be on both sides in order for it to lead to loss of dreaming. Now, we've studied in very broad terms the difference between left and right hemisphere lesions, but not, sadly, not in terms of the question you're asking. You're asking about a medial prefrontal cortex, left and right. That I'm afraid we haven't studied. We've studied left versus right hemisphere as a whole lesions. And what we find is there's no difference between the two in terms of the frequency in the loss of dreaming. That was the thing that we looked at because we were interested to see whether the left or the right hemisphere has a dominant role in dream cognition. And we found there's no difference between the two. But questions of how the content of those who do dream, how the content differs between left and right hemisphere patients, I'm afraid we haven't studied that, but it's certainly a very interesting question and something well worth studying. Thanks very much.
Another thing relates to the same part, and does this VM of prefrontal cortex, does it also play a significant role in genesis of fantasy and imagination?
Yes, so patients with remember what I was saying about the prefrontal leucotomy patients. You know, it's most unfortunate that there were such very large numbers of patients in whom this lesion was given for clinical purposes. And this question was studied in detail by Jerome Frank in America, and Partridge in England, and Schindler in Germany. And yes, there is a greatly reduced fantasy life, greatly reduced imaginative life, and also the thing that I mentioned in my talk, a general reduction in spontaneous initiative and drive altogether. They become adynamic, akinetic, abulic, anhedonic, anergic. You know, all of these things are massively decreased. That seeking system, the dopamine system that drives dreams, it really is the major motivational system of our brains. And so it's not surprising that it has all of these effects, not only on dreams specifically, but also on all of these other motivated mental states, including fantasy. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
There's another one. Do deeper subcortical brain areas like amygdala and insula play any role in modulating the content, nature, or any other characteristic of dream?
So if you think back to the PET images that I showed of what the dreaming brain looks like, you will have noticed that although the major activation was in the seeking system, in the dopamine system, there is in fact activation during dreaming sleep of the entire limbic system. So all of these emotional, and that includes the hippocampus, by the way. So all of the memory motive structures of the brain are massively activated. And there are two things I can say about that. The one is that nevertheless, the dopamine one, the seeking system, is the most important one because that's the only one which, when damaged, leads to a loss of dreaming. So the other ones, when damaged, there are changes in dreaming, but dreaming persists. With the seeking one, the dopamine one, dreaming stops completely. So that means that sort of has a more elemental, more fundamental, primal generative role in the production of dreams. But because the others are all activated, suggests they're playing a part. We have studied, for example, there's a disease called Urbach-Witter disease, which is a genetic disease that leads to the very isolated degeneration of the amygdala, which is the other really big, interesting structure in these cases. In the emotional brain. And what we find in these patients, that first of all, they do continue, even they have no amygdala, they do continue to dream. So that shows the amygdala is not essential for dreams, but their dreams are very unusual. First of all, they are short and simple dreams. Secondly, they are wishful. And there's all the bizarreness and distortion and so on that we normally see disappears. They are, in a word, like children's dreams. I'll give you some examples. One patient, she had a daughter who was disabled. She couldn't walk, her daughter. She said, I dreamt that my daughter could walk again. I was so happy. That's the dream. Simple, wish-fulfilling dream. A patient whose wife had died recently said, I dreamt I saw my wife again. It was so moving. A patient who was very poor and couldn't afford to go on holidays had once in her life been on a bus tour. And she said, I dreamt I was on the bus again. It was so exciting. Another patient dreamt, I was lying under a tree and there was beautiful fruit and I picked it and it was delicious. And so it goes on. These are the dreams of patients without amygdala. They're like simple children's wish-fulfilling dreams, which we can link to the role of the amygdala in anxiety. These patients also have no nightmares. We studied, when I say no nightmares, there's just about never does a patient without an amygdala have a nightmare. Very, very, very much less than what is normal. So the different parts, in summary, I know I'm speaking too much, in summary, the different parts of the subcortical emotional brain all play their expected role in the construction of the emotional content of dreams, but there is a preeminent one, and that is the motivational dopaminergic seeking drive. That is the thing that drives the dream as a whole. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. There is another one. There are quite a few questions. If the neurophysiology of a dreaming brain happens in our wakeful state, can it lead to a phenomenological experience similar to OCD?
No, I wouldn't say it's similar to OCD. So we do know there are imaging studies, functional imaging studies of the brains of patients in active obsessive compulsive states. And the very interesting things we find in relation to basal ganglia frontal interactions, and also in the relation to the anterior cingulate gyrus, which is important cognitively for decision making, as we know, patients with OCD have great difficulty making decisions, but it's also important affectively in separation distress, so panicky anxiety. So what the brain looks like in patients who are in the grip of obsessive compulsive states is along the lines of what I've just described, which is different from the dreaming brain. If you were to link, if you were to say which psychiatric, which psychopathological category looks the most like the dreaming brain, it is the psychotic brain. Patients in psychotic states, they have hypofrontal, there's a decreased frontal prefrontal activity, increased dopaminergic activity in the seeking system, and if they are actively hallucinated or delusional, then there's hyperactivation of perceptual cortices. And exactly as Dr. Sanyal said, what we find is the difference is in the schizophrenic patients, the perceptual cortex is activated in audio-verbal cortex, whereas in the dreaming brain, it's in visuospatial cortex. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Is there anybody in the audience want to ask any question or share a comment?
Ma'am, I want to ask one question.
Sure, sure.
Hello, Professor Mark.
Hello.
Sir, this was the best lecture that I have ever attended, sir. Thank you very much for providing such a deep lecture, and I am grateful to you, sir. Sir, I want to ask you only one question, that is it possible to see our death in our dream? And if we do see our death, then we will be dead or we will be alive after that dream? Because I don't remember, sir, in which book I read, but I read one book in which it was mentioned that we cannot see death in our dream. And if we do, then we will be dead. I don't know. I don't remember that it was book of Freud or someone else, sir.
So let me preface what I'm going to say with a general remark, and then I'll come to your specific question. You know, there are certain things that we dream about a lot and other things that we dream about a little. And I think that in itself is very interesting in terms of Hobson's old claim that dreams are just random noise. There are certain themes that human beings dream about. And I mean human beings in every culture that has been studied, and over a period now of 60 years in which it has been studied, during which time many cultures have developed and changed dramatically. What I'm going to tell you now applies, has applied for decades in the East, the West, the North, and the South. We dream of nakedness, being inappropriately dressed in a public place. We dream of being chased. We dream of something happening to our teeth. We dream of having to resit an exam, an important exam, which we've already passed, and so on. These are recurring themes in human dreams. There are other things which are very underrepresented in dreams. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are very unusual activities in dreams. People very seldom report that they were doing arithmetical sums, or that they were writing, or that they were reading. So there are certain patterns like that. I say again, I think that in itself is a source of great interest. But the dearth of dreams about dying or being dead, I think needs to be seen in that bigger context. There are many things that we very seldom dream about, and there are other things that we very frequently dream about. Incidentally, pain, the actual feeling of pain, is very, very, very unusual in dreams. So you know, we have to contextualize it. Now, that is one answer to your question. We don't dream about being dead, but nor do we dream about doing arithmetic. The other thing to say is, how do you represent being dead? It's kind of like contentless in a way. It must be a very hard thing to represent, unless you have spiritual beliefs about when I die, I go to heaven, or when I die, I'm reincarnated, and so on. And there are certainly dreams of people who have dreamt of going to heaven and who have dreamt of being reincarnated and so on. It's just not a common theme. And I would say one reason why it's not a common theme is it's the kind of thing that it's not exactly wishful to be dead. And so it would be an anxiety dream. It would be the distortion breaking down. It's not working. You're not managing the situation. And one wakes up from those sorts of dreams. One often hears the story that the patient dreamt they were falling from a dizzy height and then they woke up. They don't wait until they're flat on the ground. The anxiety state is enough to wake them up. So I wouldn't attribute any great metaphysical or mystical meaning to the fact that we don't dream of being dead. I think that we can understand it within a broader sort of pattern of observations on similar themes.
Yes, sir. So thank you for your time and thank you for your answer, sir.
Thank you.
Grateful to you, sir.
Thanks, Mark. There
Thank
are
you, Bharti
still...
ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you for allowing me.
Yeah, there are still many questions, so at least 2 or 3. And probably there are others who in the audience would like to say something. But there is just a small thing which I was just wondering while you were talking about specifically Alan's research and his presentation in America, and then your research 30 years later with absolutely different results. And I was just reminded of Freud's talking to the 4 walls when he was invited to America. And there wasn't anybody. So probably Hobson's claim brought the Freudian theory to the same area, which you kind of reverted 30 years later. But my comment was probably people need to find what questions to ask, because the research was probably in the same area or similar area, but the question where you are finding the falsifiable claim, there has to be the right question to be asked, and then only you can bring the claim to such quantifiable conclusions. Probably that is a very, very important area, which kind of distinguishes between what a scientist wants to prove. Probably Alan Hobson wanted to prove it wrong, and probably you wanted to prove it right.
I think that that's a very important point, and you're quite right that Alan Hobson wanted to prove it wrong and that I wanted to prove it right. This is why it's so important that the experimental method, it has certain rules that you have to obey, precisely because there's so much scope for us, finding what we want to find. Wish fulfillment, as we know, is a major factor, in the life of the mind. And why should scientists be exempted? I have students all the time doing their dissertations and their theses where they're constantly trying to massage the data to make it fit with what they'd originally wanted to find. And you really have to come down on them like a ton of bricks in order to get that tendency out of them. So I think that the method does protect against self-serving biases, but the point you make about which questions we ask, I think that that is very important for us to recognize that scientists have agendas and they have access to ground, and they set things up in such. And so I asked the question: do dreams protect sleep? I only asked that question because I'm interested in Freudian dream theory. That doesn't mean it's the only function of dreams. I have colleagues who believe, and I don't think they're wrong, who believe that dreams have memory consolidation functions. There are colleagues who believe that dreams have emotion regulation functions, that dreams have problem-solving functions. I'm perfectly ready to find that those things are true. they don't interest me so much, so I'm not asking those questions, so I'm not testing those hypotheses. I want to say one last thing in response to your question, which is a very good comment. You know, psychoanalysts we have in psychoanalysis major theoretical disagreements. There are schools of thought and they hate each other and they're fighting with each other all the time, trying to have their theory win the day and so on. What we need to recognize is the same applies in just about every science. There are big controversies. There are people who have access to crime. There are people who have agendas. There's one theoretical school trying to outwit the other theoretical school. The only difference is they don't rely on only one method. You know, it's important, I think, if psychoanalysis is going to be part of the general family of mental sciences, then our findings using our methods and bringing our theories onto the table we shouldn't be embarrassed by the fact that we have an agenda and that we're trying to change the field and we're trying to persuade people of a certain point of view. That happens in science all the time. But what we have to do is to accept that the methods of science which guard against us only finding Easter eggs where we hid them in the first place, you know, being ready to be surprised. We do have to not only use one method. The free association method is a marvelous method. There's nothing better at exploring heuristically, you know, what is it that motivates the life of the mind. But it's not a good method for testing competing hypotheses. And so we must see it as one amongst many methods. And that's what neuropsychoanalysis is all about. It's not trying to take away the free association method. It's trying to supplement it with other methods and add the free association method to the armamentarium of methods that we use in neuroscience too. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mark. Do you have time to take a couple of more questions?
Yes, I have. If your audience does, I'm free until the end of the hour, so I've got 12 more minutes.
All right, then we will take just the questions given in the chat. One of them is, how can antipsychotic medicines impact dreams?
Oh, well, we've studied that. So antipsychotic medications we've studied it in normal subjects. In other words, not psychotic patients, but research participants who volunteered with informed consent to take antipsychotic drugs, and we measured the effects on their dreams. First of all, you have less frequent dreams with antipsychotics. You have dreams of a shorter duration with antipsychotics. The dreams are less emotionally intense, they are less bizarre and simpler, and there are also fewer anxiety dreams. Those are the effects of antipsychotic medications on normal subjects.
All right, probably this is in order to take away the anxiety dreams, many other characteristics are also kind of made less complex and more simpler.
The antipsychotic medications.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what they do.
Yeah. All right. So there is another question, and that is that the different dream mechanism like condensation, displacement, etc. What is the role of such mechanism in the dream process in your experiments? Did you experiment or find out or research upon them as well, or was it just simply dream or no dream?
So I think what I said a few minutes ago about different methods, each method has its strengths and its weaknesses. The study of the content of dreams. Remember the condensation, displacement, etc. These components of the dream work. They refer to the way in which the latent content is transformed into the manifest content. So a method that's going to explore these mechanisms has to be a method which deals with the content of dreams, and not the presence or absence, but rather the content. And it also has to be a method where you're talking about the manifest content in relation to the latent content. So here's where psychoanalytic free associative method comes into its own. You know, the kinds of methods I'm using, we don't study things like that. So this is exactly the point I was making earlier, that I don't think that we must replace psychoanalytic methods of investigation of the content of dreams with neuroscientific methods of investigating the form, you know, or the physiological substrata or manifestations of dreams. We must do them both. I can't think of a study, certainly I've not done one, but I can't even imagine how one would go about doing one that would study the modes of transformation of the latent into the manifest content. But I'll tell you one observation which I can't resist making here. You know that we all know our dreams don't contain obvious instinctual behaviors, you know. And this is the many critics of Freudian dream theory, they say, but all these basic animalistic urges are supposed to be released from inhibition during dreams. But I don't dream of myself doing these base things. And our answer always is, yeah, that's because of the displacement, condensation, censorship, etc. You know, so the manifest dream does not reveal the latent content. The latent content is where these repressed drives are. Now, against that background, I want to tell you the following observation. Patients with Parkinson's disease or Parkinsonian diseases, because of the degeneration in their midbrain, in a large number of them, they have a thing called Rem Behavior Disorder. That is where the part of the locus ceruleus complex, which sends down fibers to the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord, which block motor activity. That's how sleep paralysis happens. Because the brainstem nuclei concerned degenerate, they lose the motor paralysis and they act out their dreams. This is called Rem Behavior Disorder. Also, experimental lesions have been done again in poor old cats, where they cut those fibers going down to the spinal alpha motor neurons. And so the cats have experimentally induced Rem Behavior Disorder where they act out their dreams. What we observe, this is my point, what we observe in those patients and those experimental preparations is that both the humans and the animals, they act out instinctual behaviors. They don't act out the manifest dreams, they act out those latent behaviors. What you see is stalking, pouncing, copulating, frightening, freezing behaviors, playing, etc., and in human beings too. So it's a very, very interesting observation that when the motor paralysis is removed from the equation, what we see, the behavior that is enacted is of an instinctual kind. I think it's really interesting.
It is. We have another question, Doctor, that is, analysts often speak of psychosis as a waking dream. Does your finding of commonalities between dream association and psychosis confirm this metaphor of psychosis as a waking dream?
Yeah, somebody, I think it was Dr. Sanyal in her discussion referred to the comment that Freud made. In fact, and Freud in turn was citing a neurologist named John Hewlings Jackson. John Hewlings Jackson said, "Tell me everything about dreams and I will tell you everything about insanity." And I think one of the reasons that Freud was interested in dreams was because they are a normal prototype of a psychotic state of mind. We are patently psychotic in our dreams, in the sense that we are out of touch with reality, and we believe things to be happening which aren't happening. We believe things to be true which aren't true. So it is, I think, really a justified statement to equate the dreaming mind with the psychotic mind. It is a psychotic state. That said, however, I also don't want us to gloss over the variety of psychotic states. What we see in manic depressive illness, what we see in melancholic psychotic states, what we see in schizophrenic, what we see in toxic psychotics. These are all different. They all have subtle and important differences. The psychosis we see in Lewy body disease, the psychotic phenomena that arise with temporal lobe seizures, etc. They're all psychotic, but there are many differences. So I wouldn't want to say dreaming is the same as psychosis, full stop. I would say, there's certain common denominators in many psychotic states that you also see in the dream state. And I wouldn't want to take it further than that. So I'm saying two things. First of all, I think dreaming is a psychotic state. It does share important fundamental features with other psychotic states. It therefore is a source of insight into what's going on in psychosis in general. But that is not to deny the many differences between the different types of psychotic states, including dreams being just one type of psychotic state.
Thank you, Mark. There is another one. Probably we are reaching towards the last question. Does the dream work happen during dreaming or during the process of waking up from a dream? Do we project personal meaning onto it? That is the secondary elaboration. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So I was just going to say that luckily I don't need to answer that question. There's a predecessor of ours who already answered that question, and his name was Sigmund Freud. He called that process secondary revision, and he did indeed include it as part of the dream work. So I will simply quote that great authority on the matter.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so
Really,
much.
thank you. Really,
being with us.
Professor Solms. I would never forget this lecture. Never.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
I've enjoyed meeting with you very much. I've enjoyed your discussion, Dr. Sanyal, and I've enjoyed the questions of the audience very much. It's been an interesting interchange for me. I only hope that sometime soon I'll be able to visit your society.
Yes,
and congratulations
we would
on
wait
your
for you. Thank you.